So once again, thank you very much for coming along this evening. I'd like to introduce you to Alexandra Giannopoulou, who's our guest speaker. Alexandra is a postdoctoral researcher at the Blockchain and Society Policy Lab at the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam. She's also an associate researcher at the Institute for Communication Sciences in Paris within the research group Information and Commons Governance. And she has also worked as a research fellow at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin. She's a graduate of the University of Thessaloniki and of the University of Paris-West Nanterre La Défense. She holds a PhD from the Center of Legal and Economic Policy Studies of Multimedia. She has spent time as a visiting researcher at Stanford Law School and has been a junior lecturer at the University of Paris-West Nanterre La Défense. So, as you can see, she is a one-woman distributed network, all on her own. And we're delighted to have her. I can't think of anyone more qualified to introduce us to the joys of blockchain and its public manifestations. And so, without further ado, I introduce Alexandra.
Hello. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you to Professor Magnami for the invitation. It's lovely to have the honor to introduce to you to blockchain technology and its legal implications. So a little bit more about my current research and where I work. I am part of the Blockchain Society Policy Lab. This is a 5-year project funded by the European Research Council, and it's an interdisciplinary team by legal scientists, social scientists, and also computer scientist experts that we're looking into the interactions between law and technology and distributed ledger technology, more specifically blockchain applications, and how to regulate them, and how does society will adopt blockchain. We have already some publications that you can find online now or quite some time. The presentation that I'm giving tonight is based on these publications. So if you need more information about more specific aspects of the technology, feel free to consult those publications. So to begin with a little bit of history. The development of decentralized technologies at scale has always been the holy grail for the organization of social structures. Almost 20 years ago, we had the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, declaring how the states have no sovereignty where we gather on the internet. So this did not work out very well because the internet progressively became more and more centralized. We had the Web 2, where peer production, commons-based peer production was supposed to bring this revolution, this reorganization of social structures from the bottom up. Currently, we're in the stage where blockchain also promises this social organization in a disintermediated and trustless manner. And it remains to be seen whether this will actually be the case. It all started in 2008, where we had the publication of a paper called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system by a person, an entity, or a collective we don't really know, that goes by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto. This was the paper introduces the Bitcoin, which is a distributed ledger technology that creates and controls the value of tokens that can be transferred and exchanged by anonymous people and entities in a decentralized, disintermediated and secure manner, demonstrably by the technology. So, in the words of this enigmatic creator, they propose a system for electronic transactions without relying on trust, without relying on intermediaries. Seeing the value of the technology that underlines the cryptocurrency that was Bitcoin, in 2015 we had the official launch of the Ethereum blockchain that uses the technological design introduced and used by Bitcoin in order to create smart contracts and to enable transactions that are not only based on value tokens, but also to various other transactions that two individuals can make that do not necessarily trust each other and that do not want to go through a specific intermediary. Blockchain, first of all, is not a completely new technology. It is not an innovation by itself. It is innovative in the way that it combines different aspects of pre-existing technologies, that is distributed ledgers, asymmetric cryptography, and Merkle trees. So a little bit on this last one that you might not be very, very aware of. Merkle trees or they're also called hash trees. They are the technology that permits the creation of blocks, the chain of blocks, basically, that bind the one block to the next in order to make this ledger immutable. And I will come back to that point later. So what about definitions? This is one specific topic that has been very divisive among the technologies experts because there is not a commonly agreed upon definition, but we can define it by some of its characteristic traits. So in the context of our research, we define blockchain as an append-only distributed database, which is collaboratively stored, maintained, and updated by all of its users. On top of this distributed database, we can use complex cryptographic methods in order to ensure that the information that is recorded on this chain is secure and no one can actually tamper with this information. This is basically a very generic image that describes the difference between a centralized network, a decentralized network, and a distributed network. And so on the context of blockchain technology, we're on the third case, on the distributed ledger. And it was for the first time in human history that society has a technological alternative to the centralized institutions that maintain authoritative records. For example, about how much money we have, what type of transactions are we going to do, what property we own, what kind of contractual rights and obligations we have. And so we do not need to go through these centralized institutions that are private or public to enable those transactions. This development may actually have fundamental implications on the establishment of norms on social organization and then control that actually maintain these trusted intermediaries that are now ingrained in our social structures. Of course, this has this technological design has some ideological underpinnings that makes blockchains and states actually conflicting. On the one hand, we have a technology that claims that wants to go beyond the current establishment with trusted intermediaries, but on the other hand, we have a state that actually wants to maintain those intermediaries or wants to actually bring technologies under the regulatory framework that exists now because of the types of transactions that happen that that affect current norms. So blockchains as objects of regulation. This will be my topic for today's presentation, and more specifically, I'm going to talk about data protection on blockchains, and GDPR compliance. In order to approach this subject, we have first to address conceptually what decentralization actually means. That it's not only an ideal, it's not only an ideological goal. It is not only a technological design, but it should be established as this complex system that it consists of either technical tools, conflicting ideas, and governance structures. And the more specific example of this complex system of that decentralization actually is can be found on the definition. So there is no exact agreed upon definition of the blockchain, and that means that this will have an effect on the scope of the regulation that we want to enforce, because we need to determine legal compliance solutions for specific types of blockchains. Again, on the justifications behind the creation of the technology and the creation of data protection laws, we find some conceptual compatibilities and incompatibilities. First of all, the conceptual compatibility between the two is that they both want to enhance individual autonomy. They want to empower the individual, and they both enable users, participants of the network, or data subjects to control their data. They give the tools to data subjects to actually have a say in the way that their data are being processed. On the other hand, they are both the GDPR and blockchain technologies are constructed in a way that they tend to be global tools. So on the one hand, we have blockchain technology that is a global network of nodes, a global network of participants that is not bound by any jurisdiction. And on the other hand, we have the GDPR, whose scope is ever and ever expanding. Every time that personal data are being processed, referring to a European data subject, then data controllers and companies, even if they are on some other part of the world, they need to comply by these specific norms. And so we have this incompatibility between those tools that actually want to go towards the same direction. One of the main problems when we try to identify legal compliance of the GDPR on blockchain is the fact that the GDPR has been designed for a world where data are centrally produced, centrally collected, centrally stored, and centrally processed. This is obviously not the case with blockchain technologies, where we do not have central actors that are points of control for data gathering, data processing, but it's actually decentralized paradigm. Every node, every participant of the network processes data that can also be personal data. So how do we proceed? How do we identify the actors, and how do we identify legal compliance? In order to identify how the control and the data processing on the blockchain happens, we need to not only look at the technical infrastructure at the various layers of the stack of the blockchain, but also to identify what different actors that participate in the network do, but also how they participate in the governance of the network. That means the decision-making processes. Which actor has the specific power to define how the personal data control happens and how data processing happens. So the combination of these attributes will not only define legally the actors of the network, but we also define their legal liability. On this presentation, I will address two factors related to the GDPR. So first of all, which personal data, and second of all, which actors are going to be liable. And we're going to do this by examining these interconnections between the technology, the governance, and the ideology behind it. There are three main functions of the network that you will need to keep in mind, and that will be key in order to identify personal data and actors that are liable. First of all, the fact that the blockchain is immutable. That means that no one can actually tamper with the data that are already registered on the network, because they are demonstrably secure. Secondly, that it's a global tool, that we have a transnational processing. And third, it's the fact that there are some personal data that are essential to the functioning of the blockchain. So which personal data are we talking about? We're talking about the data that are actually being stored on the blockchain. That can be plain text data, but this is usually not the case because of size constraints, and also by the processing time that makes the database very slow. And so we try to minimize the amount of data that we put on the blockchain. However, there are some data that need to be recorded because it is in the end of the database. So we record transactional data. Sorry, that means who gave what to whom. Every exchange, that can be an exchange of cryptocurrency, that can be an exchange of contractual rights, that can be an exchange of property. Needs to be recorded on the blockchain. So we have the metadata that describe this transaction. We have the encrypted personal data. That means the public key of the individuals, the parties that are involved in this transaction. And then we have the hashed personal data. That is an encrypted way of securing information on the blockchain. So what does the law say about this data? The law says that, first of all, anonymous data are not covered by the GDPR, but pseudonymous data are. Again, going back to the definitions, what's the difference? What is purely anonymous data? What is pseudonymous data? So the threshold for anonymity is quite high when it comes to the GDPR, and it is information that does not relate, and it is impossible to refer to an identified or an identifiable natural person, and that is, those are the definitions that are actually agreed upon by the GDPR. However, on pseudonymous data, the difference is that there is a way to identify the data subject, the natural person behind those data, and that is even if the necessary information in order to arrive to this re-identification comes from information that's held by a third party. And here I refer you to a recent case by the Court of Justice of the European Union, the Breyer case, that decided that dynamic IP addresses are actually personal data, even if the necessary information to identify a natural person is held by the ISP, by the internet service provider. So even then, dynamic IP addresses are considered personal data. And this is sort of the analogy that we need to keep in mind for the threshold of anonymity and pseudonymity. What does that mean for the blockchain data? So we're talking about hashed personal data. We're talking about encrypted personal data. This is not the first time that data regulators have addressed this issue. And so we have the Article 29 Working Party, that is data protection officers that give non-binding interpretations and about processes that relate to personal data. And so they decided on an opinion about new technologies and encryption technologies that neither hashing nor asymmetric cryptography can be qualified as anonymous data. So we only have pseudonymous data that will be covered by the GDPR. What does that mean? It means that we need to find a way to make blockchain technologies compliant with the GDPR. However, at the same time, there are some pseudonymous data that are essential to the functioning of the blockchain, that they will be publicly processed and collected and distributed to a worldwide network of actors. And at the same time, it means, because it is an append-only database and the data are going to be to continue being processed on the database forever, means that even if some level of anonymity is agreed upon today, later on with new technologies, and I refer to you, for example, quantum technologies, that will break that threshold, and that means that what we considered as anonymous data will come back to be pseudonymous data in the blockchain environment. This has been an issue, this has been a riddle that is very hard to solve on both a legal and technological level. So this is not a purely academic debate. This actually affects a lot of technologies that are being affected right now, that are being created right now. So we have both technical and legal solutions that have been proposed. The simpler one is store your data off-chain. But as I showed previously, there are some data that are simply not possible to be stored off-chain, because you need some data to actually create those databases. And again, the simplest example I can give is the hashes that bind the blocks together. It's impossible to not have that if you want to build a blockchain. There are also some privacy-enhancing technologies that have been proposed and developed, both in the cryptocurrency world, but also in the more general blockchain applications world. And some examples are zero-knowledge proof. This is a new technology that is currently being discussed a lot, and even the Ethereum Foundation is going to eventually implement it. But the problem with privacy-enhancing technologies is that we need to identify which ones reach that level of anonymity. And that also implies some governance decisions, in the sense that are we going to create standards like we did with the internet? And if we should, who will create those standards? Because we're talking about a decentralized network that does not have centralized actors, that does not have committees and official bodies that will give standardizing decisions that will be applied across the technological infrastructure. On a legal level, I believe that the solution needs to be contextualized, in the sense that even rights that are related to personal data are not absolute rights. They're always interpreted according to the context and more usually according to the available technology. So I think the solution will be somewhere in the middle, where we evaluate the fact that we're talking about a decentralized network that continually processes data, but there is a minimum threshold of data that are essential for the functioning of the technology. And we need to make some conciliations when we're talking about protecting not only personal data, but also innovation processes. So this is always going to be a balancing mechanisms. There is also another solution that is currently being discussed in the European level is that we can create regulatory sandboxes to examine how can we build that compliance. And on a more practical level, what I wanted to add to these solutions is that there's no doubt that at some point we will, be it by regulatory sandboxes or by actually good privacy enhancing technologies, that we will arrive to a point where blockchains will be compliant with the GDPR. But the problem is what happens to the existing blockchains. For example, what happens to the Bitcoin blockchain? It's very hard to take technological decisions on the design of the technology on such a big community that has a lot of trouble achieving decisions and has not well-specified governance structures. Finally, when it comes to technological standards that relate to anonymization, related to specific rights, and I'm not going to go very far in the specific rights that are described in the GDPR, but for example, I'll just mention some of the issues. So we have the data minimization principle, that data controllers need to retain as little personal data as possible for the purposes of their processing, but what happens when we reach a point when we establish some technologies that are privacy enhancing? Can users actually turn against the blockchain developers or against a foundation to say, why did you not use X and Y or Z technology that would actually better apply the data minimization principle? And what does that mean for the enforcement of their rights? The fact that the data is stored forever on the blockchain, does that mean that I mentioned here the turning anonymous data into pseudonymous data, but what does that imply for the right to be forgotten, for example? And those are specific questions that are that require a presentation on their own. Now I'm going to go to the actors. I'm going to do an overview of the basic actors that are involved on a standard blockchain, but this is a very high-level approach, so bear with me. We have two types of liable actors that are described on the GDPR. We have the data controllers. So the data controller determines the purposes and means of the processing of personal data. And the data processor processes personal data on behalf of the controller. So those are the definitions given by Article 4 of the GDPR. Now we have different actors on the blockchain network. We have the nodes. So we have full nodes or partial nodes that will are all the participants of the network that actually download and store the database and do the processing. We also have the miners that verify transactions and they add the blocks to the blockchain. We have the developers that create the technological infrastructure and maintain it. And we also have third parties that can be exchanges, wallets, different companies that come and create their own applications and smart contracts on top of more foundational technologies such as Ethereum, for example. So how do these actors play out in the liability game? I'm going to start with the miners. The miners verify the transactions and they add the blocks. Does that mean that they're controllers? Well, they only validate the submitted data. They do not determine how the processing happens. They do not. So they apply the consensus mechanism, but they do not have a say in how the processing of the data happens. Are they processors then? Well, the French data protection officer, the CNIL, said that they could be processors, but this is not an agreed upon qualification. Secondly, we have the developers of the network. Think, for example, the developers that maintain the core developers of the Bitcoin blockchain. They define how the data is being processed by way of the protocol. So they define and maintain how the technology is actually going to process personal data. So does that mean that they're controllers? Should we hold them liable? Well, they may consider to determine the means and purposes of the processing, but they are also bound by the consensus of the community. They are bound to the consensus, to the technological requirements of the blockchain. So they do not autonomously decide how processing happens. And also, if we take it a step further, because we're talking about an open source technology, does that mean that if we hold liable developers over how they develop the technology, does that mean that we should hold liability for all open source developers, which is obviously not going to be the case. Then we have third parties. We have the third parties, as I told you, the wallets, the exchanges, that any smart contract that sits on top of Ethereum blockchain that process and analyze blockchain data for commercial purposes. So they could qualify as data controllers for the data that they request from the users. Suffice to say here that third parties will actually build their technology in a way to store most of the data off-chain. So they will definitely be data controllers for the data that they store off-chain, and they will be responsible for that data. However, if we can define also the third parties as data controllers for the on-chain data, it is hard to identify who the data processor is going to be. Then we have the full nodes. The nodes that download the blocks and the transactions, and they verify them against the consensus rules that are collectively established. Are they joint controllers? However, there is no joint determination. Each party autonomously decides to participate or not on the network, autonomously decide also when to leave the network, and the system is shaped by the nodes on their individual behavior. Are they then individual nodes, individual controllers, each node by themselves? Well, no, because they are subject to the system rules that are designed by the developers. So if you see the interactions that happen between the different actors of the network, that makes it very hard to pinpoint specific actors to enforce liability. Also, the nodes, they do not have the ability to influence the consensus rules or to modify the ledger. They also participate in the network, and they play a very essential node in the blockchain technology, in the blockchain by itself, but they do not have this power to influence the consensus. Finally, and I will close with the users. Are they both? So the users is, for example, a person that will go to buy or sell Bitcoin, for example. They do not necessarily they could be a light node, but they do not have to download the whole blockchain to participate. They can just participate just to make the transaction and depend on other people to add the transaction to the network. So are they both data subjects and data controllers? They do have control over the personal data, their personal data, through their private key. And they share the same information, and they are subject to the consensus-based processing rules that define the technology by itself. Here, as for the users, again, the French database, the data protection officer, the CNIL, said that they could be subject to Article 2, the exception to data processing liability, that is for processing for personal or household activities. That is a very specific interpretation. Again, I personally do not think it is the case. I think that they try to change how personal data regulation interprets household activity. I don't think this is the case because we're still talking about a public blockchain. So they may do transactions for their own account, but it's still recorded on a public blockchain. So what are the conclusions? First of all, the best legal advice is that it depends. It depends on the blockchain. It depends on the specific project. Are we talking about the Bitcoin blockchain? Are we talking about a private closed, a permissioned blockchain? So we need to look at specific governance structures, specific actors, and which exact exchange are we talking about. Finally, on a more broader level, we could talk about reinterpreting GDPR principles on data controllership, especially because we will take into account the decentralized architectures that are existing, and also the innovation prospects that have been very much put forward by the European agenda. So that's all. Thank you. Did I go overboard? That was a lot of information condensed. I hope you managed to follow. Do you have any questions?
Lucy.
Well, yeah.
We don't have a traveling mic, unfortunately, so if I could ask you to speak as clearly as you can, and then perhaps Alexandra, if you could just repeat briefly back the question, if that seems appropriate. Lucy.
Your very last conclusion was rethinking the GDPR principle of controllership, etc. Have you come up with some ideas of how that what it might look like, or how you'd like to massage the existing GDPR?
Well, I do have some very early stage ideas about processing of personal data on decentralized architectures, and that is, I think that from a more high-level approach on how we regulate data on the European level, I think that there is this tendency to promote data flows and to promote data sharing. At the same time, we have also finally achieved on the GDPR a very strict data protection regulation, but I think that there is a middle ground where we will finally, with the help of the advances of technology related to the blockchain, privacy-enhancing technologies, I think that we will arrive on the conclusion that some personal data will be permitted to circulate on a public blockchain. So that would make the data controller interpretation irrelevant to begin with. But this is a very early stage hypothesis that I'm making.
John.
The concept of blockchain, how do you hope to get these unknown actors, which they are in many cases, to engage with you in relation to GDPR? How would you enforce this?
It depends on the actor. So enforcing on different actors, first of all, we have legal entities. A lot of the actors are actually legal known entities that have their own legal compliance obligations to begin with. Enforcement on the personal data, on a personal level, for example, with individual nodes or individual users, the only parallel I can make is with the copyright enforcement. We call them the copyright wars of peer-to-peer networks and torrents, when at some point we had a lot of heavy litigation and heavy strict enforcement of individuals that could be identified, and that is also the case with blockchain users. But I think that there is a point where the balance between what the costs of pursuing individual users with the benefits that comes out of it reaches a point where we stop doing that. We stop pursuing individual users and we look for other solutions. Then again, it depends on the blockchain. I'm thinking now the Bitcoin regulation, for example, and we have the AML rules that will maybe apply that will actually it's a fact, they will apply. So that means that there will be identification obligations for cryptocurrency and virtual tokens and exchanges. So that will also facilitate litigation.
Alison.
Thank you. This is fascinating. It takes two very sexy subjects and puts them together in a really interesting way. and it struck me when, as you were talking, that it is very blockchain. It's very blockchain specific, because obviously some of the most interesting applications of blockchain that I've come across in things like land registries and things like that, they're public records, and therefore, you would imagine that those are exempt from any of these considerations. But you mentioned the right to be forgotten, and it seems to me that that's a really interesting problem. And I just wondered if you could say any more about that issue in relation to some of the blockchains where GDPR would apply.
Yes. So this is a very specific example, the right to be forgotten, and how we enforce it on the blockchain scenario. This is a specific example that has, it was one of the most famous ones that made, that made the news. Because one of the traits of the blockchain is the fact that we cannot remove information. That is actually its feature. So it's not considered a bug that we need to solve. It's actually its feature that makes it why it's so revolutionary and important. On the other hand, we have a right to be forgotten that says that given specific context and specific application, specific conditions, intermediaries should remove information from a public public platform because it relates to a specific individual. First of all, as I said, not even the right to be forgotten is an absolute right. So it is subject to a lot of conditions. And I think that in a lot of cases that involve, for example, anything that happens with cryptocurrencies, it will be very hard to imagine a scenario where the right to be forgotten would apply, because it is hard to make these conditions apply on these blockchains. At the same time, the application of the right to be forgotten is also subject to the limits of the available technology, the limits of the technology that is concerned. So this is also something to be something to take in consideration. And there are ways there are technical solutions that are being proposed. For example, if the data is stored off-chain and you only have a hash, then you can remove the data from the database, and then the hash just refers to nothing. So, well, there is one thing. Or we can make some supervised removal, but which is something that is feasible practically, but that has problems on the governance level, because it means that we start reintroducing intermediaries on what is to be a disintermediated technology. So there are solutions, but I think again we need to find the middle ground between technology, legal compliance, and ideological underpinnings of the technology.
I just wanted to ask, sorry.
Go ahead.
With the regulation of GDPR coming in, has it actually stopped any of the innovation around the use of blockchain? Has it hampered anybody? Is the regulation almost being left behind in terms of what blockchain is being used?
Well, not yet, but for two reasons. First of all, that other than cryptocurrencies that have their own issues, problematic aspects by themselves, we really do not have a very much working scenario of any blockchain application that is used in a more than a B testing phase. Yeah, I don't know. There is no case yet. Yeah, but that's the point. The point is to not stifle the innovation to begin with. So. Hi. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. You are the moderator.
I was very amazed by the last paragraph. I mean, you are something very real about the future. I just remember about the net neutrality, and in the same way, the blockchain will impact so much our future, our technology future, that the GDPR will become kind of not relevant enough to what will happen. Do you think that GDPR will kind of have kind of the same the same future as the biggest companies that try to force everyone to slow down and to comply with their limitations. Because you know, the GDPR was I don't know, maybe even started with having in mind that we can regulate everything and put a legal team on everything, but that won't apply anymore when we will have anything else than just finances and I don't know other things, other contracts using blockchain. I mean, that will be a tipping point where we can go back and just stop everyone with laws.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, the GDPR has a lot of problems with new technologies, so it has a lot of problems with AI, artificial intelligence data processing for different reasons, and it has a lot of problems with the blockchain for different reasons. However, it is a very valuable tool, and it's a very good thing that we managed collectively to agree to such a high protection of our personal data to the current state of the internet. To the current highly centralized platform market-driven internet that we use right now. So this is a very I'm by no means disregarding the value of the GDPR right now in our current technological reality, everyday reality for the user. So it has a very very big societal value in our privacy, in our lives. However, for the future, it does pose some problems, and that's why I don't think that the solution would be to, for example, make a new GDPR or rethink the rules. No, because it just came to force, and it's an instrument that took a lot of years of negotiation between different countries to arrive to this stage. And so I don't think the solution is to hope that the GDPR will become obsolete. I personally don't think so, even though it does pose a lot of problems to a lot of big companies. But I do hope that we rethink those, go back to the principles, basically, go back to the definitions and re-examine what we mean by personal data, what we mean by anonymization, what we mean by pseudonymization, right to an explanation, right to be forgotten, the scope of the application. And if we recontextualize how we interpret and enforce those rights, then we can find that sort of compliance between, that conciliation between innovation and protection of personal data.
Hi. My query, thank you for your presentation, it was very thought-provoking, and my query is around, at the minute, in terms of both data compliance and cyber security, the biggest challenge for companies, all the breaches being heard, are to do with the data they hold. So it seems that blockchain offers an opportunity that faster companies can get rid of the data, they actually de-risk themselves, because the data isn't there to be stolen. So I'm wondering, things like the sovereign, the new blockchain for sovereign focused on identity, where you can actually just distribute identities and all that information back to people. I'm wondering how if you looked at that and any thoughts you have would be interesting.
Yeah, so, well, even the sovereign identity, again, is not a new concept, that it didn't come to be with the blockchain. So in 2-3 words, the sovereign identities, it has a political ideology also behind it, that it is not the state that should control our identities, demanding from social security numbers to passports to IDs to driver's licenses to the way that that society recognizes us as individuals, but we should be in control of that, and it should be a sovereign identity when every person can decide, and it can be on a global level. So that's the concept behind it. It has a high political also ideology behind it, and with the blockchain, the fact that it can be encrypted and secure and not easy to tamper with, then it sort of gave this political ideology a new life. I'm not sure that is a solution to the problem that you described. I think we're quite far from sovereign identities, and yeah.
Was the idea that if you hold your data, so not like reading passports, any of those things, but you go to do a task and you to give over so much data which is held forever that you can just give it for a certain amount of time, and perhaps that you consented to that data being on the blockchain and you know it's going to be there for that purpose. So is there a way to, does that almost take care of GDPR or not quite?
Not really, because there is even the issue of consent is very difficult to prove on the blockchain level, and just the simple participation on the network would imply some sort of consent. Then on top of that, we just need to enforce. We need to think how to enforce data minimization and privacy by design principles, and that's where it goes back to the technology. Yeah.
Is there any real way that compliancy can actually be implemented? If you take into the context of Bitcoin, where a lot of Bitcoin users would work through a VPN through a different country, there would also be regularly changing public keys to try and remain anonymous and not to be found, basically. Is this really an uphill struggle that you'll keep on coming against? It'll be very hard to enforce, especially on VPN countries that are non-GDPR compliant anyway.
Well, actually, because the scale of the technology is not so big yet. Well, it is big, but again, for worldwide standards, it's not big enough. There has been a lot of research showing that re-identification of users that did the transactions through their public keys is actually not so hard, given enough data. All data is personal, basically. So that. Combined with the financial regulations that are going to be implemented right now, makes it very hard to remain anonymous even on a blockchain, on a Bitcoin level.
Perhaps any final questions, and then we'll wrap up. I suppose I had one question that was interesting to me is how long is it going to last? You know, how long before someone cracks Bitcoin technology to render visible all the people that are hiding behind it?
Depends who you ask. So personally, I don't think that this is a technology that's going to become obsolete in 2, 3, 5, 10 years. I think that the foundational principle of cryptocurrency is going to stay. Of course, we're not talking about all the different altcoins that exist right now most of them are scammy, at least looking. But foundational cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin will remain running, even by a small amount of dedicated users, because there is, again, some sort of ideology behind it, some sort of following to who Satoshi Nakamoto is. There's a lot of theories behind it. Yeah, so I think it's going to stick around for a while. But I don't think anyone is really trying right now to identify who Satoshi Nakamoto really is. Like, it doesn't matter anymore so much, and it wouldn't solve anything.
Thank you very much. I have a captive audience. There's one more thing that I'd like to do this evening, and that is drum roll. You may or may not be familiar already with the chief public information service that the Legal Innovation Centre here at the university provides, which is the legalinnovation.ai website. We are publicly launching it tonight. It's been in actual operation for a while. We've been testing it, and we've reskinned it. I want to give a lot of credit for that to our technical officer, Matt Wiley. And so the resource is publicly available, as I say. Resources, educational, visual law, gamification, learning. Let's see, education. You can get the general idea that there are a vast panoply of resources that have been collated and collected from around the world on the various different themes that are relevant to legal technology or legal innovation. This, I'm taking you just briefly through the resources that we provide in relation to education, courses and curricula, on the different continents. There are also, I keep going down, research centers, United Kingdom, university clinics and incubators and labs, etc. Now I could do this for all the different drop-down menus, so they have a whole series, but it would take a while, and I don't want to detain you any further. But believe me, it's an extremely valuable and comprehensive collection of materials, and there's a news feed. It's all wrapped up in this extremely attractive package, and it's yours for the handsome price of $9.99, not $9.99, $4.99. No, it's publicly available and free, and we'd really like to see a lot of people using it. So I just wanted to make you aware of that, and if you could visit the site and spread the word that this is available, and through that mechanism, hopefully we generate a further connected community of people interested in legal innovation. At that point, I'll stop with, once again, thanks to Alexandra for a wonderful presentation, and invite you to take some refreshments outside, some food and drink with us. Thank you very much for coming.